Welcome to Trial Site News podcast series. Today we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jean-Jacques Ryder, a Broward Health Medical Center physician in Florida. Now, we covered a story about Dr. Ryder back in April where he, along with his pulmonologist wife, were pioneering the use of the anti-parasitic drug Ivermectin on COVID-19 patients. Now, it's been fascinating to watch your journey since then, and so without further ado, Dr. Ryder, it's been an honor to have you on the show with us today, and excited to talk to you guys.
Same here. Thank you for having us. It's an honor and a privilege of talking to you. This has been quite an interesting journey, as you alluded to earlier. And unfortunately, that journey is probably just beginning.
And I see we also have the honor of having your wife, Dr. Juliana Cepelowicz Rajter, with us here today as well.
Dr. Juliana Cepelowicz Rajter, she's one of the co-authors of the ICON study. So I felt, she has a lot to contribute to the story, so I asked her to be along with me.
Excellent. Well, we're glad to have both of you here. Now, Trial Site News crossed paths with you guys when we first heard of your work involving the Ivermectin COVID-19 protocol in Broward County, Florida. Could you share with us how you first got into medicine and where did you grow up and what gravitated you towards medical school and then medicine?
So, well, that's a very long journey. So I was always fascinated by science, going back to, middle school. And it was a long and arduous journey growing up in Belgium. My parents were doing business with the States, and at a certain point, a decision was made to relocate the family from Belgium to the States. And the best time for that was when I started college. So there I was as a young lad, an 18-year-old lad, speaking some English, but not being proficient in it, attending college in Philadelphia.
Now, where did you first practice and how did you make your way all the way out to Florida?
So most of the time I did my medical school, residency, fellowship, and I remained an attending in Philadelphia. And at the time that we got married was a very, very bad hurricane in Philadelphia, 16 inches of snow. My wife, being from Brazil, said, I don't want to put up with that anymore. And we said, okay, we're going to go somewhere warm. So we looked at Florida, we looked at Texas, we looked at Nevada, we looked at Hawaii. And ultimately, it was Florida that won out. And South Florida, obviously, being at the top of the list.
Well, I'm sure Broward County in particular is grateful that you did choose Florida. So what did you feel when you first heard about the novel coronavirus? Did you think it was imminent and dangerous or just more of an abstract threat?
It's a very difficult question to answer. When this first started, I started thinking more, this is going to be like Ebola-like or like SARS-1, the original SARS. It's going to be something that's going to be horrific, self-limited, will burn itself out, and that's going to be the end of it. But subsequently, within a few weeks, as we saw things happening in China, and China essentially shuttering down their entire economy, which is unheard of. I mean, they are a manufacturing hub, and they shut everything down. I was like, we're in for trouble. And when I saw that happening, I was like, it's only a question of time of this to spill out of China and spill out worldwide. And I was actually early on being very, very concerned about that, pushing for extreme measures to be taken. People weren't taking me too seriously. I was wearing masks early on. People were chastising me for wearing a mask. People were saying, well, you might pass fomites along to other people. And I was like, no. If I don't get the flu shot, it's mandatory at most institutions for me to wear a mask. So the fomite business that you're trying to talk about really is not applicable. The bottom line here is, I realized that this was going to be a major problem, and started taking measures quite early on. For example, getting supply for my practice so we would have appropriate personal protective equipment for myself, for my staff, that we would have sanitizing solution for both the offices, for the hands, etc. So took that very, very seriously very early on.
So let's shift then to Ivermectin. What brought your attention to the drug?
So this really, that journey, in my opinion, really started with my wife. So I'm going to let her talk about this.
Okay. So in early April, I was reviewing the medical literature for treatment options for COVID-19. I remembered back then reading articles about when Zika was an epidemic, that they had some trials looking at ivermectin for such RNA virus like Zika, dengue, amongst others. And that always stayed in the back of my mind. So then on April 3rd, there was a team of researchers led by Dr. Wagstaff from Monash University in Australia that released information regarding the in vitro or test tube effects of ivermectin on COVID-19 infected cell lines. So the results were absolutely eye-opening. I reviewed the article with my husband, Dr. Ryder, with great interest. But the article provided us with no guidance really as to how to apply those findings in the clinical practice for human use.
So how then did you come up with the idea for the protocol at Broward County?
Well, that's kind of very interesting. So within 48 hours of that article being reviewed by the two of us, you know, like nothing like bedroom literature, we were reviewing that, and, you know, I had a patient of mine with COVID-19 that was deteriorating rapidly on standard therapy. Standard therapy at the time was hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, zinc sulfate, some multivitamins. Really, that was the extent of the treatment. And as she was deteriorating rapidly, she was on 50% oxygen and rapidly increasing in a matter of hours. So at that point, the hospital was already in lockdown, meaning family members were not allowed in. So I called the patient's son up and said, listen, you may want to call mom. Mom is deteriorating rapidly. She's likely going to end up on a ventilator. So talk to her now. And the son was more astute than the average person about COVID-19, especially early on in April. And he was like, well, doctor, if she gets placed on a ventilator, isn't that a horrible outcome? And I was like, yes. I mean, at the time, mortality with these patients were 80, 90%. So I'm like, yes, it's going to be really bad news. So we went back and forth. It's like, doctor, there is something else. There must be something else. I'm like, no, sir, I have nothing. Nobody has anything. Remdesivir was only in compassionate use at the time. The data about dexamethasone was not out there. There really wasn't anything else. So as we were going back and forth, I tell him, listen, there is this one study that I reviewed 2 days ago in test tubes, in vitro, about the use of ivermectin. He was like, okay, so let's do it. I'm like, well, not so fast. I don't know how to use it. The doses that were used by Dr. Wagstaff in those studies were so high that they would likely be toxic to humans. I can't do that. So he was like, well, what other dose could you consider safe? So I went through him with the literature about pinworms and other parasitic infections. And I'm like, well, there is a regimen of ivermectin, which is 200 microgram per kilogram. That is safe, being used worldwide all the time. Good clinical data. Is like, do you suspect it being any different for this? I'm like, no, the safety data of a drug is based on its pharmacokinetics and not of the indication for use. So that's as far as the safety, not efficacy. So I'm like, it should be safe. He's like, you know what? There is nothing to lose. I agree. Talk to my mom. I'm going to talk to her also. And both of them agreed to try ivermectin. Okay. So she got ivermectin. She deteriorated a little bit more for the next 12 hours. Within 24 hours, she had stabilized, did not get intubated. Within 48 hours, her FiO2 requirements were coming down again. Within 3 or 4 days, she was back on a nasal cannula. And probably within a week or so, she was discharged to home.
That's incredible.
So that was really the first entry into this. Now, 48 hours after I administered the ivermectin to that patient, 2 other patients on that exact same wing deteriorated. They were headed the same direction that she did, but they were already more advanced. They were on 90% oxygen. So they were much, much more advanced. So I discussed it with both patients. As I finished the discussion with one patient, I went to the other patient, talked to him. I was able to salvage that 3rd patient and gave him the ivermectin. He never got intubated. He improved within 48 hours, came off high flow nasal cannula, regular nasal cannula, subsequently got discharged. That 2nd patient that I saw second, the intensivist got into the room because they got called and they didn't want to wait. They intubated that patient. I felt a little bit prematurely, but that data wasn't really known very well at the time to postpone intubation. But fortunately, that patient subsequently got extubated. He He got trached, he got transferred to an LTAC, long-term acute care, got subsequently decannulated, currently in acute rehab, doing well on room air also. So now we had 3 patients. Well, wow, you know, that's not like a major thing. Now, over the course of the next few days, I continued treatment with ivermectin. I reached out to the pharmacy department because they started asking questions, obviously. And I told them what I was doing. They said, listen, doc, we only have enough ivermectin to treat a handful of more patients. So use it judiciously. So I'm like, no problem. I selected people that had more advanced disease, not terminal, but more advanced, and continued having great success. And about a week into this, I had treated about 15 to 20 patients with ivermectin with good success. And that's where I faced a very interesting dilemma. Do I keep this to myself? Do I proceed with a study? Or do I share the data with my peers in a case series? And I think it must have been about April 10th when I posted the results of my preliminary case series to social media, and specifically physician-oriented social media groups. And it went viral a little bit within those arenas. It went viral. Subsequent to that, I believe on April 23rd, that's where NBC picked up the story. And yeah, April 13th. And NBC kind of did the story, and that's where many more people became aware of ivermectin actually not just being an in vitro study anymore, but that it was in vivo data that was going to be successful for the treatment of COVID-19.
Yeah, and at that point, people were looking for any hope. So what you did would have sparked a lot of interest. So how then was the protocol developed, reviewed, and approved by the hospital or county health board?
So what ended up happening is when I had that 20-some patients that had been treated, 15, 20 patients, and I went and released the information, pharmacy department was able to procure large amounts of ivermectin. So we were no longer, you know, with a few measly doses. We had thousands of doses of ivermectin. Other clinicians at the hospital had seen the success that I had with ivermectin, and they said, you know what, this is interesting, and that went to P&T, Pharmacy and Therapeutics. And also the chief medical officers at the institutions became involved, and the decision was made through P&T, the CMOs, and the physicians that are on the COVID committee that this was going to be part of a protocol that would be implemented across the 4 hospitals that made up part of the Broward Health system.
Oh, wow.
So not just the main hospital I'm at, but the 3 additional hospitals. And subsequent to that, it kind of became pretty much standard of care of receiving an ivermectin dose as soon as COVID-19 was confirmed. And if patients remained sick at 7 days, they would be redosed with the second dose, and 7 days beyond that if need be, etc. In our study, there were, I believe, 13 patients that got redosed the second time with ivermectin. If the patients did well and they were ready for discharge or had been discharged, they didn't get that second dose. But that's pretty much how that went about. It's not as if this was something that had been planned long in advance. This was really mostly based on clinical success, based on trial and error.
Well, it's a tribute to the nimbleness, and we thank you for your work that you did. So what about challenges or politics to overcome? Could you share how you went about convincing the health board to approve the protocol?
So it did not go through the health board. It was really a clinician-driven decision at the facility. Now, my team, in order to do the data analysis, we needed to get an IRB, the Institutional Review Board's approval. So we submitted for that, and that took probably 6 to 8 weeks to get that approval from the IRB to be able to do the study. Now, the patients continued being treated, but I had really no access to the data itself to run statistical analysis besides my own personal patients. But now it was no longer about just my personal patients. There were physicians across the entire hospital system using those medications. So as soon as the IRB approval was received, data analysis started, and that's the reason why the study was a retrospective study, because we could only start looking at the data retrospectively after the IRB had approved the study protocol. Now, We started analyzing the data. That was probably in late April, where we had the approval and started doing the data collection. And by April 26th, that's when the ICON study was submitted the first time for peer review. But as you well know, the peer review process is long, slow, arduous, and there are tremendous amount of politics that are in play when it comes to peer review literature, especially if this is not pharma sponsored, endorsed. Quite to the contrary. I mean, there are some pharmaceutical companies that may lose a lot of money if this really becomes the standard of care. So we were facing delays in getting the peer review process completed. The entire team met, and on June 9th, we decided that we had waited long enough from April 26th to June 9th. And we said, we're going to submit the ICON study to a preprint server to expedite distribution of the information. Once again, the focus was here on saving as many lives as possible because the information was there, the statistics were there. On most situations in studies that are of this nature, most clinicians can derive their own information and their own decision as to how valid that is and how they would apply this in their own daily care of patients. And that's why, you know, we went through this to MedRxiv, we submitted it, and we have had tremendous response to this.
So how did you organize your study then? We know your wife got involved as well. And how did that work out as a team? And how does your wife complement you professionally and vice versa?
So this has been a very fun and difficult journey at times. You know, we are husband and wife. We're both physicians. We're in practice together. We run the practice, PSC Florida. We run our practice together. I mean, we're together almost 24/7. So that brings challenges, but that also brings opportunities. What I mean by that is when she starts thinking about certain things, it becomes obvious to me what the thought process and where it's going and vice versa. So I may not have crossed paths with this article necessarily on April 3rd, were it not for her reviewing the literature to see what would be helpful. If we would not have discussed that data together, there might never have been an ICON study in the first place. Were it not for that one individual son of that patient who pushed me very hard about alternative ideas, this may never have happened either. I think it's just a confluence of ideas and events that led to this. But, you know, it got us to where we're at right now.
Right place at the right time and a good team.
Yes, sir.
So now, as the study results became clear, you must have felt great about it. Can you share more about the study results and translate them for as many people in the audience who may not understand all the terminology?
Okay, so as he mentioned, the ICON study is a retrospective observational study. So unfortunately not a randomized controlled trial for the reasons he mentioned above, getting IRB approval, etc., that looked at hospitalized patients with confirmed COVID-19. And it ranged from March 15th through May 11th with follow-up all the way through May 19th. There were a total of 280 patients. 173 patients were treated with ivermectin and conventional care, whereas 107 patients in the control group were treated with conventional care. So conventional care means the usual standard care in the community at the time of enrollment. So whatever the physician, the treating physicians at the time, it was at their discretion to treat to whatever they thought it was recommended. So there was the control group, which was really the standard usual care versus the usual care plus ivermectin at any point in the admission. And ivermectin was dosed at 0.2 milligrams per kilo on day 1. And as you mentioned as well, some patients, which were only 13, got redosed on day 7. So we were looking at the primary outcome of the study being all-cause mortality. So in the entire cohort, the 280 patients, the all-cause mortality was 18.9%, which is in line with what we see in other studies. In the control group, the all-cause mortality was 25%, and in the treatment group with the ivermectin, it decreased from 25 to 15, which was statistically significant. That's an odds ratio of 0.52. In other words, it dropped the mortality by 48%, which is huge. And to date, or at least by the time that this article was submitted, there was the only study that showed a decrease in mortality. Then we looked at subgroup analysis of patients with what we call severe pulmonary disease at onset. So patients who were on high FiO2 greater 50% or greater, or they were intubated requiring mechanical ventilation, or they were on non-invasive ventilation like BiPAP, or on high flow oxygen. So those are categorized as a severe pulmonary involvement. So the mortality in the severe pulmonary group overall was 80.7 in the conventional group, and in treatment group with ivermectin, it dropped to 39%. So once again, from 81 to 39%, and statistically significant, which is major. Additional yet unreleased data, we're now looking at propensity matched patients. So just to give you a heads up, the all-cause mortality is also statistically significantly lower in the patients receiving ivermectin, even after correcting for unmeasured variables. That's what the propensity, yes. We looked at 97 matched pairs, and even correcting for, similar demographics, etc., that the numbers persisted.
So pretty much that is part of the article that we have submitted for peer review. We decided that we wanted to save something for the peer review process, so they would not say, well, you have already submitted all the data, there is no point in doing a peer review. No, the most powerful data is actually being saved for the peer review publication.
Oh, wow. Can you share more about the study results? Any surprising elements, areas that you delivered results that you didn't expect?
So as far as what we looked at, univariate statistical analysis. So looking at the patients who died versus the ones who didn't die, we found that the following were portended a worse prognosis. So advanced age, leukocytosis, lymphopenia, as well as if the person was either a former or a current smoker, and history of cardiac disease, they were associated with adverse outcome. And when we looked at the multivariate analysis, the issues that persisted were advanced age, severe pulmonary disease at presentation, and being in the control group and not ivermectin. Those were associated with adverse outcome. So I guess the interesting things that we saw, there are a few things, but one is that the use of hydroxychloroquine or hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin did not confer adverse outcome in the analysis of the study. We speculate maybe that the use of the hydroxychloroquine plus minus azithromycin in our institutions were carefully being monitored for the EKG findings. So we had initial EKG obtained on every patient and daily QT monitoring if these patients needed to be on such drugs, and cardiologists were also monitoring if they saw a need to discontinue medications. That was done. So we believe that that may have explained why patients on this regimen did not have a worse outcome as compared to other studies that came after. And the other interesting aspect I would say is that the Black race was not associated in our study with adverse outcome. We further analyzed that, and we figured, or we believe that it's because the age of these Black patients in our group was younger than the white patients, because we did have a lot of white nursing home patients admitted to the study.
Now, here at Trial Site News, we have noticed that despite the mounting real-world evidence, there is little interest by drug companies, academia, or government. Don't they want low-cost, effective, and available treatment for COVID-19 patients?
Well, it's kind of interesting. So if one looks at what's currently available, remdesivir, number one, it showed no survival benefits in the largest study to date. It decreased hospitalization length by 4 days. Pretty much. The cost of the medication, if it's a non-intubated patient, is about $3,100 for 5 days, or if it's an intubated patient, it's $5,700 per patient for a 10-day course of treatment. Wow. There are persistent shortages of remdesivir. I have not been able to start remdesivir on a single patient in the past 6 days because the state of Florida is pretty much out of the medication. And each time when I go to the Department of Health for Florida to request remdesivir, you get a message that there is none available currently. Now, in our study, it showed a 48% all-cause reduction in mortality for ivermectin. The cost of ivermectin, I would gather, maybe $10, $20. I mean, I don't know the exact price. I cannot imagine it being much more expensive than that, especially with bulk discounts that hospital systems would get. It's widely available, inexpensive. There are very few side effects. Remdesivir, could cause renal failure. We know that ivermectin in our study is effective against severe disease at onset. There are additional studies right now and case series coming out that show tremendous promise in mild and moderate disease. So it can treat pretty much every single severity of disease. So I think that's kind of, big pharma has a lot of vested interest in making sure that their medications prevail. And also one thing you cannot forget, I'm not coming from Harvard. I'm not coming from Stanford. I'm not coming from Yale. I'm coming from a community hospital. I am a clinical pulmonologist, and so is my wife. We are darn good at what we do, but we're not in academia. We're not academicians. And I think that sometimes gets held against us. And if we had an academic pedigree from one of those institutions, things might have gone differently, but who knows? I cannot read people's minds.
Right. Now, what is the status of attracting a major journal for these study results? Is there any interest?
Yes, there is. It is currently submitted to a major international journal for peer review. We passed the preliminary screening. We passed the peer review process, and it's currently in statistical review as of 2 days ago. We're awaiting further word about the statistical analysis. We feel good about that. The statistical analysis was reviewed by statisticians, so we feel pretty confident about that, but who knows? I mean, we're just waiting right now as far as the peer review process.
Well, that's hopeful, and we're definitely interested in seeing how that turns out. So what then is the status of organizing a clinical trial for ivermectin?
So here's where we stand right now. So I'm currently working actively and with other benefactors to create a coalition of the willing. And that's how I'm really referring to it, a coalition of the willing, to proceed with a large multi-center randomized control trial. Based on our study, we have information as to the power needed to obtain the necessary numbers for statistical significant results. And in my opinion, this can only be achieved by a cooperative effort, meaning getting many institutions. I'm not talking dozens, I'm talking 20, 30, 40 or more institutions to run a study concurrently through a single protocol to collect that data over the course of a few weeks and then be able to do the data analysis promptly and get the information out there. In my book, time is against us. Every day that this goes unanswered, there are hundreds, thousands of people just in the United States who die that could otherwise have been saved. So what I would encourage with this podcast is for facilities, physicians, other benefactors who are interested in participating in our inpatient and outpatient randomized controlled trials to reach out to us via email. And the email address is COVID-19@P from Paul, S from Sam, C from Charlie, Florida spelled out .com. So pscflorida.com, because we're going to need assistance with staff, for statistical assistance, statisticians, data collection, study design, ideally even assistance of a contract research organization in order to be able to get this off the ground in a timely manner. You know, it's really going to be a coalition of the willing where we all chip in some, and then we can get a study off the ground without necessitating the input of a big pharma who is then going to have a say over how this goes.
Right. And we'll definitely put your email in our description into this video as well. Are there any last thoughts for members of the Trial Site Network?
Yes, I think getting the information out that there are alternatives, and I'm not saying that this is the last word. I think there might be other options out there that are even better than this. People need to think outside the box. Einstein once said, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting another outcome is a definition of insanity. Well, if you look at what has happened over the last few months, there is a lot of insanity going on. So in my book, you know, I applaud Gilead for the efforts that they have put in with remdesivir, but there are other answers out there. There are many other chemicals out there, substances that can be used that will show benefit. I think investigators need to think outside the box. I think there needs to be a cooperative effort by all parties involved. I would love, with a capital L, for the federal government, CDC, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, FDA, NIH, I don't care which one, to reach out, to help us set up a study like this. They have experience in large studies like this, and getting their expertise would be so valuable. We put a protocol together with their assistance, with their input, with their visions, and subsequently that would make the IRB process so much easier at each institution because it would have been reviewed by one of the large nationally endorsed federal agencies. That is really what is needed. And, you know, if people could call their politicians, could call their healthcare departments to try to push the message, I think that would be quite important. And that's where I see sites like TrialSite being so incredibly important, getting the message out, a grassroots effort to build this up.
Yeah, and the bottom line is saving lives. I mean, that's what it's all about.
Right.
Yes, sir. This is not about making money. Nobody's going to make money on this. This is really about saving people's lives. And we're just talking the US. If you start talking about South America, if you start talking about Asia, Africa, Europe, these are drugs like Ivermectin, which are widely available, inexpensive. They are manufacturing them themselves. If this is really a route to take, we can save countless lives without bankrupting economies, without bankrupting healthcare systems, and we can start opening up the businesses again and get people back on track and say, listen, if you get sick, we have something to help you. I think that would be an incredible, incredible type of situation.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. It's been an honor and a pleasure talking to both of you today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for sharing the message, sir.
The pleasure is ours.